Welcome to Long Blue Leadership, the podcast where we share insights on leadership through the lives and experiences of Air Force Academy graduates. I'm Naviere Walkewicz, class of '99. Today I'm joined by a leader whose career has taken him from the flight line to the halls of Congress and now back to the very institution that launched it all. Major General Thomas P. Sherman currently serves as Vice Superintendent of the Air Force Academy, where he plays a critical role in guiding the development of our future officers and ensuring the Academy remains a world-class institution for leadership, character, and day one readiness to win the future fight. A 1995 Academy graduate, General Sherman has spent nearly 3 decades serving in key operational, strategic, and command roles. He's led at every level, from squadron to wing command, and his assignments have included everything from nuclear enterprise security to homeland defense, policy development at the Pentagon, and legislative affairs at the highest levels of the Department of the Air Force. Prior to his role as Vice Superintendent, General Sherman served in the Office of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, where he was the principal military assistant, leading policy integration across joint staff, interagency services, and combatant commands. He's perhaps best known in command circles for leading the 88th Air Base Wing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, one of the largest and most complex wings in the Air Force, with a focus on people-first leadership and mission excellence. General Sherman, welcome to Long Blue Leadership. We're so glad you're here.
Me too. It is great to be here. Thank you.
We're excited, and we're going to dive right in because I think what is so special for our listeners is really hearing these moments that have changed your life.
Absolutely.
I'd like to start at the Academy.
Okay.
You turned down a pilot slot. You were rated, but said no.
Well, actually, it was a little bit before that.
Okay.
And so, you know, it's kind of interesting because that was the draw that brought me here. Is I just had this incredible passion to want to fly, and I love flying, and I truly enjoyed it, especially through all the different airmanship programs and things like that we had here. The experiences were fantastic. Mm-hmm. But, you know, as I was starting to learn more about myself going through the Academy, I was starting to feel my heart getting pulled in a direction of wanting to really lead people and really spend a lot of time working with the enlisted. And I think that came from a couple different areas. I think it was some really unique exposure that I got during my Ops Air Force time, which I went to Ramstein Air Base in Germany during Ops and just had our action officer that worked this, I think, just did a phenomenal job. And I really started getting pulled to what was then called security police.
Okay.
You know, kind of then complementing that is actually when Lori and I got together and started dating, because Lori is here in Colorado Springs, but she grew up as an Air Force brat. Yes. My father-in-law is a retired Chief Master Sergeant, and so there was a lot of mentorship that was taking place around the
sure there was a lot of
DiMatteo dining room table when I was a young cadet. And I think one of the things that her parents really taught me was just the value of the enlisted force. And so I was feeling my heart really getting pulled. And so obviously there's a conundrum.
Right.
There's a conundrum on what were the root desires that brought me here? What were the things that I was learning as a cadet, my joy of flying, and also particularly the culture at that time was that was really the job that you needed to aspire to be. That was the expectation of cadets. And so then to really kind of run counter to that strong current was really kind of a unique, you know, almost unnavigated area.
Right.
And so to really kind of take the story out to its next level is that I'd really gotten to a point where, you know, talking with people there, we hadn't had the AMT program, but there were these NCOs that were kind of tangentially attached to cadet squadrons. And so I got a chance to talk to one of the master sergeants that was there, who was a maintainer by background. And I was kind of pouring my heart out to him on, you know, what had I been talking with my now in-laws about? What did, where was my heart pulling me? And so he said, give me just a second. And he picked up the phone and he called my AOC. And he goes, you know, hey, you going to be there for a little while? And this was a Friday afternoon. He said, I got a cadet that needs to come talk to you. And he hangs up the phone and he goes, now you go tell your AOC what you just told me.
Wow. And
so I ended up going to my AOC's office that day. And we had about a 2-hour conversation about this. And you know, I sat down and really kind of took the time to explain to him really what was I feeling, you know, from his standpoint. And obviously, I really try to see the best in people. And so I think from a noble place, he was doing his best to convince me that I was making a grave mistake, and went on to talk to me about what his concerns were, the career field that I was looking at, things along those lines. Right. And we can save that conversation for another time. But I think really where the foundation came in is where we started to talk about leadership. And, you know, what I was asking him to do was to pull my rated recommendation form. So we had just submitted them, and I was asking him to pull my rated recommendation form. I didn't want to compete for it anymore. Wow. And so we started to talk about leadership. And he says, hey, Cadet Sherman, you need to understand that, leadership in this Air Force is being the lead F-16 pilot on a bombing run, putting iron on target. And that's true. It's a very important part of leadership. It is a very important part of tactical operational leadership in this Air Force. So he's not wrong in that space. But I was looking at it from a different lens, and I was looking at it, I think, on a larger level. And what I don't think he realized is that 30 seconds before I walked into his office, he set me up for success. I just happened to be waiting outside the office, and all of a sudden I looked on his corkboard, and somebody, and I don't know who it was, had pinned a note that was written to Airman Magazine by an Airman First Class.
Okay.
And this Airman First Class titled this, "I Need a Leader." And this A1C felt so strongly about what they were feeling, and I have no idea who this person was.
Wow.
Felt so strongly about it that they put pen to paper, and this would have been the fall of 1994, and sent this into Airman Magazine. And it says, "I need a leader. Commissioning sources. Send us lieutenants that we can look up to, that will hold us accountable when we do wrong, that will encourage us when we do well, that will be an example that we can look up to, that will care about us as human beings, because you are not sending them to us now. Air Force, I need a leader." Wow. Like that 30 seconds just before I walked into his office, that changed my life. And it changed my life because for me at that moment, what I was getting ready to go ask my AOC to do, what I was looking at inside myself, like that became my charge. And so as we spoke, 20-year-old, Cadet First Class Sherman, I'd been 21-year-old at the time, Cadet First Class Sherman, pushed back on my AOC and I said, "Sir, I disagree." I said, "I want to be that guy."
Wow.
I want to be that guy that A1C is asking for on your corkboard outside, because that's leadership in this Air Force. And so to his credit, he said, "Hey, I want you to go think about this over the weekend. Think about what you're doing. Come back to me on Monday. No questions asked. I'll pull it if you want me to." And I left there. And I remember feeling like, not like a weight had been lifted off my shoulder, but I almost felt like this sense of like, now I've got my purpose. Because that little article has shaped me my entire career. And I mean, to this day, and at a scale, as a lieutenant, my scale is this big on what I'm affecting to help do and be what that A1C needs, to a wing commander with thousands, but I always keep it in the back of my head. And after all of these years, I am still thinking about, am I doing right by that A1C that 31 years ago felt so strongly about something that they wrote a note to Airman Magazine, and that became my charge.
That is incredibly powerful. I'm a little bit without words because I'm thinking about, first off, being brave to disagree with an AOC. I mean, I think that takes courage in being, and showing your leadership there. Were you always like that? Have you always been someone that is steadfast in a decision and being able to kind of speak out?
So I get that from my parents. And, I grew up in Corona, California. My mom and dad are amazing people. And, we didn't grow up with a lot of money. And we grew up from pretty, meager background. And my mom and dad had made a decision early on in their marriage when they had my sister and I, that my mom was going to focus to make sure that Nancy and I got an education. And my dad was going to work as many jobs as he had to put food on the table. And, sometimes my dad was holding down 3 jobs to make sure that we had nutritious food to eat. And my mom was working miracles to make sure that we were fed well, but that also that she was dedicated and had the time to volunteer for things like PTA, being involved as a class volunteer, making sure that we were involved in things and had exposure to things. That what they did was they also instilled in me this really strong blue-collar work ethic. And it was this aspect of, if I just roll up my sleeves and put in the work, anything is possible. And so, kind of on that line, this young kid growing up, with a West Coast father and an East Coast mother and just this really, neat family background, that things for me that I believed in, I would go after with all of my heart and soul. And so I found out about the academy when I was 12 years old. And so, at 12 years old, we were going to a community event there in Corona, and there was an officer recruiter, Captain Craig was her name, and we started talking. She goes, "Hey, did anybody talk to you about the Air Force Academy?" And I said, "No, this sounds great." And she goes, "Why don't you come see me?" And so from there, I just made this decision as a 12-year-old, and I worked all the way through junior high and high school to get here because, to go to your point, like, I made a decision, I'm going to see this thing through.
Wow. Well, okay, so you knew you were going to the academy before you graduated high school then?
Yes. Yeah.
What a
In my
journey.
mind, there was no other option.
And so anyone in your family serve, or were you the first one in your family to serve in the military?
So I am the first officer and career member of the family.
Okay.
And so my dad was drafted and went to Vietnam in 1967 and stayed through Tet of 1968. I had an uncle, Harry Lee Schmidt, who was a C-47 loadmaster in World War II and Korea. And my grandfather was actually a part of the initial kind of what was the foundation of the OSS in the Navy, doing beach recon on beaches in the South Pacific prior to island hopping campaign and island landings. And so there was this real heritage of service,
Right.
just not career service.
Okay.
And so, but even then, you know, as a kid, I always had in my mind, like, okay, one way or another, I'm going to serve. And if I do an enlistment and then go to college afterwards, but I had this idea that, okay, I'm going to serve. And then all of a sudden, this became this amazing conduit that got me here.
Right. And they also had ties to aviation. How did they feel about your decision, your family?
So it was interesting because they knew how passionate I was about aviation growing up.
Right.
I mean, we did not miss an air show at March Air Force Base. The Chino Air Show, which was the Planes of Fame, which was all historic aircraft. I volunteered as a high school student to work there, and we helped restore airplanes with me and my friends. You know, it was interesting because my parents were very supportive in, okay, where's your heart leading you?
Mm-hmm.
And what is it that makes you feel so strongly about this? Because when I first talked to him on the phone, I called him from Ramstein Air Base and said, hey, I think I know what I want to do in the Air Force. I want to go into security police. And my mom was like, what's that?
Mm-hmm.
And so as time went by and I explained it, I think my parents probably all along knew that that was probably going to be a very good fit. And then after commissioning and at my first assignment, I think that they were certain of it.
Right.
Yeah, they were absolutely certain of it.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I want to dive into this profession a bit because it's interesting. You know, you mentioned when you came in, it was security police and
Yes.
security forces, and you hear people saying defenders and peacekeepers. So there's this lineage and this heritage,
Absolutely.
I'm sure, to it. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that and then maybe lead us into that next transformational moment that you might have had in this role?
Okay. So it was... I'm very proud of the fact that, you know, I am part of an ever-decreasing group of folks that came in when we were still security police, and that was really still the peacekeeper days, because this was all kind of the follow-on of the Cold War. The peacekeepers were our cold warriors, and that was a huge part. Our defenders came in, and really that name started to really grow in 1997 when the name changed from security police to security forces, and we were actually going back to some of our heritage that was in Operation Safe Side, which was the combat security police squadrons in Vietnam. So when you think about the courage that was displayed during the Tet Offensive at places like Tan Son Nhut, those were safe side warriors that were a part of these combat security police squadrons. And so the very part of the lineage of the very beret and flash that we have is actually a tip of the hat to the lighter blue berets and that flash with the falcon and the crossed runways that goes back actually to our safe side heritage days. The beret goes back even farther than that. It goes back to Strategic Air Command Elite Guard back in the 1950s. So it's this great lineage. And so, you know, for me, part of it was like when I got my first beret, wow, it meant something to me. And then, you know, as we then kind of transformed along the way and this amazing career field grew and the aspects of this air-based ground defense, which was really, I would say, was kind of the draw that got me into wanting to go into security police, was I really liked this idea of how do we do base defense and what is about base. The law enforcement side was intriguing to me, but it was base defense that just had me captivated.
And was that something that you found out early in your career after you graduated the academy, you're now in security police.
Yep.
Is that when you kind of realized, wow, this is where I want to go in air-based ground defense?
So interesting, it even happened at ops.
Okay.
So as we were spending time with the security police squadron, I ended up spending time with a captain who was heading up USAFE's elite guard. And there was an interaction we had as I was doing a ride along. He's like, hey, you need to come see me. And so I went and met up with him, and he took me around and introduced me to all of his airmen that were a part of the guard, knew something all about them. And then we went into his office and talked, and he had gone to Ranger School and Airborne and things like that, and said, hey, like the future of the career field is actually us looking to the past, and really kind of got me fired up on what we called back then air-based ground defense. So when I got to McChord, McChord Air Force Base was my first duty station. And the great thing about going to AMC first is that AMC is a mobility folk. I mean, it is all about mobility and the operations associated with it. And so the first thing that my task was as the second lieutenant in that squadron was I was the air-based ground defense flight commander. So that was, I mean, we would go out to, Fort Lewis, and we would bivouac for days. And I had, a 44-person team that was a base defense sector. I had specialized K-9 units, heavy weapons. And back in those days, we had 81 millimeter mortar teams and fire direction centers that we would set up. So I just got completely on board with the air-based defense piece. And so that was very passionate for me, which then made the next step to Korea an absolutely logical next location, going to the Wolfpack at Kunsan, not only getting a chance to then stand up Gwangju as a part of the first air expeditionary unit to go back to Korea since the Korean War, but then doing the mobile reserve aspect of it. And it was a great assignment.
Wow. So you were right in from the very beginning. You got kind of just into it all. So
when we go back, when you were talking to me about like, hey, when you make your mind up on something, so I had this like 5-year plan built out.
Okay.
And, my 5-year plan was, okay, I'm going to do my first assignment at the first opportunity to PCS. I need to go remote. I need to go to Korea. And then, okay, how can I get another overseas assignment after that? And then what do I need? So the thought was, let me get to as many MAGCOMs as I can, as fast as I can in my career, and use that as a place, okay, because I want to build my experience base out, because even as a lieutenant and young captain, I didn't want to come across as a one-trick pony. So my thought was, let me just get as much as I could under my belt early on. And so after I left Kunsan, I ended up going to Aviano Air Base in Italy, which for me, when you look at like those moments in life that are transformational, this was transformational on a different level. This was, some assignments you go to are very much professional growth assignments. Right. This assignment for me was very much a personal growth assignment.
Let's talk about that.
Okay.
So tell me more.
Okay. So up until then, I mean, when you think about it, 4 years at USAFA, very uniquely focused on a plate that is overflowing with things that you need to get done. So
right.
you're focused on, everything from grades to military training to all of those things. And then I get to my first base and I am just working. And I'm volunteering for everything, and we have got a heavy ops tempo of exercises and things like that. And my leadership was fantastic because they were throwing me into every opportunity I could. And then, boom, I go to Korea, and that is a unique warfighting focused, and at Kunsan especially, was heavily warfighting focused. So now all of a sudden, I am spending really, when you think about it, the last almost 7 years being uniquely focused on mission.
Right.
And so I get to Aviano Air Base, Italy, and the first thing that happens is Operation Allied Force kicks off. So I get there in January, boom, Allied Force kicks off. I think it was in end of February, beginning of March. And wow, what an amazing mission-focused experience. And then after we finished up Allied Force and the base returned back to more of its steady state standpoint, it was the Italians that took me under their wings, that because I made a specific choice, because I grew up, my mom's side of the family are all Italian immigrants.
Right.
And I was always at my Nani and Papa's house, and there was just a lot of that growing up, which is that whole West Coast dad, East Coast mom thing. But I didn't know, my mom and her brothers never spoke Italian, and there was a lot of that thought back in those days that, hey, we're here to be Americans, so we're going to learn English and we're not going to speak, the language that we came from.
Right.
And so my mom and her brothers really never learned to speak Italian. And so my thought was, gosh, I grew up with this as such a strong part of my childhood that I need to put myself in a position where I can learn the language and start to kind of get an appreciation on the culture.
Wow.
And so I specifically and really lucked out on a location. But I was about 20 kilometers away from Aviano.
Mm-hmm.
I was in an amazing town. I was the only American living in the complex that I was in. So I was like, if I'm going to learn, I need to just dive in.
The way that you do.
In the way that I do and just start learning. And so
Right.
I ended up kind of building this support group of Italian families that all kind of took me under their wings.
Well, wait, I have to
Yeah.
ask you a question because back when you're at the academy, you said you spoke to your now in-laws. And
Yes.
so was Lori not a part of this?
So Lori and I, that's an important part of the story. Lori and I dated for 2 years while I was a cadet. And when I was in tech school, her and I made the very difficult decision, and as painful it was, to part ways.
Okay.
So her and I actually parted ways for a few years.
Okay, so
And
while you did those other assignments,
absolutely,
you were apart.
I was single at the time. Lori was still here in Colorado Springs, and I was getting, a lot of assignments under my belt. Which, to be honest with you, in retrospect, it was very fortunate because I may not have made the same assignment choices had I been married at the time.
That makes sense.
And because I wasn't married, there were no other variables that I needed to factor in other than personal experience goals
Right.
that I wanted to play into. And so I could just put down whatever assignment I wanted. And that allowed me the opportunity to just focus on job.
Mm-hmm.
And while Lori and I stayed in touch, and I stayed in touch with her parents over the years, I was in Aviano, and her and I were not together at that point in time.
Okay, that makes sense.
So-
I was like, why were you alone in Italy? Okay.
Right. Well, it's
Right.
a fair question. But I also think that being single in that environment allowed me, and that's where I think it helped me develop as a person. And so there were a lot of, I think, really wonderful things that happened during that time. And that was because I was so uniquely mission focused. It was this amazing group of Italian friends together that really kind of taught me about there's a time to relax. There's a time to work, there's a time to relax, and there's also a real human need to enjoy life and enjoy time together, which is quintessentially Italian. And so as my pool of just these amazing people that, by the way, for the last 25 years we've been going to visit.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, these are the same
They become
families.
family.
Absolutely.
Yes.
These are the same families that took me under their wings when I was a lieutenant, are the same families that were all tuning in as we were doing a live stream of me pinning on my second star. And so I've never been stationed anywhere else in my career where I felt more at home. And so I think this sense of like, wow, this, like, independently as my own person, this feels like home. And as time went by and I started to get an appreciation for actually things that were a part of my childhood, because, we would have these long, huge meals. We would spend 4 or 5 hours at the table as a family. And for me, this was all normal. Well, that was also a part of kind of normal Italian life and normal Italian culture.
Right.
You're not going out to dinner with your friends unless you're investing at least 3 hours at the restaurant. But for me, this felt normal to me.
Right.
And so it was about, you don't need to eat your food in 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need
So
to,
contrary to you,
right.
Safa, by
You don't
the way.
need to chew no more than 7 times to swallow. It's all so.
That's right.
So
you can taste it. It's
absolutely.
okay.
So it was
Yes.
about like experiencing that and, learning even just some things that became personal passions, like, how wine is made and why, wine pairing matters and how is this process. And so all of a sudden this personal experience, and I think growing as a human being was taking place there.
Wow.
And I was maturing as a human being because I had gotten all of this phenomenal job experience under my belt.
Right.
But this was where I was growing as a human being. And, it's interesting. As time has gone by, I have noticed just how impactful that time was, because there are things that I've noticed even as a senior officer that I feel very strongly about that I don't think I felt as strongly about as a junior officer. And it was because of that experience. And it was the aspect of when people are on leave, let's let them take leave. There is a part of the human experience that you need to enjoy time with people that you care about, because what it does is you're not slacking off from work. You're not leaving everybody hanging. What's happening is that because you're taking some time to just enjoy life with people you care about, when you come back, the restorative effects that have taken place because you simply breathed and you enjoyed what it was that you were doing, and whatever your passion was, unencumbered, you could enjoy that. And we all realize that there are times, especially as you get into positions of authority, that, hey, they're going to need to call you periodically. But what was interesting is that, especially, I'll give an example as a wing commander. As a wing commander, despite realizing how important that mission is and how big Right Pat was, Lori and I took leave, and we took 2 weeks of leave, and we went back to Italia and visited our friends and enjoyed life, because the culture helps us to slow down. But what it also did is I gave my staff some parameters. Hey, here are the things that I think are important. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, here are the things that I think are an 8. So an 8 or higher, call me. Right. Don't text me. I said, physically call me, because I will answer the phone knowing it's for, and then you have my undivided attention. Right. But what it also does is it means that my vice wing commander, who is there, that I am empowering my vice wing commander and showing to everybody else, I trust this leader to lead this wing in my absence. And if it's something that really needs my involvement, they'll get a hold of me. Right. But I think our junior leaders need to see that at the senior most levels, that I can physically trust and emotionally trust my vice, my deputy, to hold things down while I'm gone, and that I'm not irreplaceable. And that if I did my job as a leader, I set the conditions that allowed the wing to thrive in my absence, and didn't mean that the wing had to hang on every decision I made or every word that I said, that I set the conditions that allowed them to be successful and fostered the leadership that allowed them to lead in my absence. And I felt great while I was gone, because I knew the people that we had there, and I knew the investment that we made in them. Wow. So that was kind of a long, trip around this. But
no, I think it was so powerful that you kind of learned that about yourself in Italy. And then would you say that there was anyone that you saw emulating that, or was it just something over time you developed this realization that you need to enjoy life and you need to allow people the space to do so?
So I would say the people that I was emulating in that aspect were a lot of the families that were there. I have been fortunate that I have worked for some commanders who at different times in their life felt the same way. Mm-hmm. Conversely, I also worked for commanders that did not feel the same way. And, an interesting case in point on something that on an experience I had in a command billet after I had left Aviano. This is when Lori and I were back together. We were married at this point. Yes. And I had a group commander that was frustrated about me taking leave. Wow. And called me every day at 1500. Every day at 1500, I got a telephone call. And what that does is now all of a sudden you're eating lunch and the clock is getting closer to 1500, and you start to get that knot in your stomach, and you're like, okay, what are we going to talk about today? And so, unfortunately, you don't see some of the same appreciation for that across the board. So how do we deal with it? Yes. The best thing that we deal with it is that's where the buck stops. We don't pass it down to our people. So after I got the call from him, I didn't call back to the squadron. Mm-hmm. I got the call from him. We went through the call. Mm-hmm. We answered the questions. And I didn't then immediately turn around and call back to my ops officer who was running the squadron at the time and say X, Y, Z. And we just left it there, because at that point in time, the buck's got to stop at that point. So I think that's kind of the alpha and the omega of learning, and then also having kind of your own personal resilience and courage to say, I accept that the buck stops here, and I'm not going to let this roll downhill to my people.
I think that's an excellent leadership lesson, because I was going to ask you, what does that look like and how would you handle that? And so you went right into that. Thank you so much for that. So what has it been like leading security forces, defenders? What's it been like? Has there been a moment in time where a particular assignment or something's really stuck into your mind or into your heart because it's just really affected you?
Absolutely. I will tell you this, as we go back, as we were kind of talking about, decisions that you make in your youth, and that critical decision that I made in the fall of '94. I mean, I have worked with some of the most amazing people I've worked in my life. I have gotten a chance to go to places I never thought that I would see. And so, when you kind of roll up, I would say it was my final squadron command, and I would say that was a real culminating squadron command. So I commanded 4 squadrons, and we command early and we command often, and there's a lot of responsibility that's placed on us as young officers to command as a young officer. And so, having the opportunity to command as really 2 times as a captain or 1 time, as a major select, then as a major, then as a lieutenant colonel. So that culminating command would have been Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan in May of 2012 to May of 2013. And, it was interesting because all of my previous squadron commands had all been vested in either the contingency response or the kind of combat contingency environments. And it was almost like all of those were leading me to this moment. So let me just kind of set the conditions on what Bagram was like at that point in time. We had grown the squadron to about a 1,200 person squadron, wow. Huge squadron.
Right.
And what we were also responsible for is we had taken over battle space ownership from the Army. So the Air Force was controlling 220 square miles of battle space throughout Parwan province, which is a huge, it's twice the size of Washington, D.C., wow. If you want to try to give a comparison more or less.
Yes.
Is fair to look at it that level as just a huge amount of terrain in which our airmen were responsible from everything from humanitarian operations and goodwill outreach to engagements to literal kinetic action and combat in the battle space. Wow. And so a part of this culmination was, really it was an environment where as the Defense Force commander, as that squadron commander to them as a lieutenant colonel at that point, how we are weaving ourselves into their lives and how we are working with their section commanders and how we're working and managing the value of our perimeter defenses with our teams that were going outside of the wire, doing legitimate patrolling and engagement and things along those lines was huge. And I think that is an example. And when you look in the rearview mirror to say, gosh, now a lot of this makes sense. Like all of these assignments, whether by design or whether by fate, somehow gave me an experience that at this moment I needed it most. And I think, as I talk, we've really enjoyed being here with the cadets and talking to them about, how does a leader really develop trust and how does trust really manifest itself? And so, through the time that we were there and the engagement as their leader, not just the leader who's just simply circulating, because that's important, but they also need to see your decision-making and your strategic thought and how do you react under pressure? How are you reacting as we've got incoming in? And what do you do being the person in the Joint Defense Operations Center helping to manage that? And how are you both taking care of people and how are you managing mission? And they see that. And so I would say that the development of that level of trust, especially in an environment where you are literally dealing with high costs, is huge. And so I think there was one situation that really rests on my heart that, and I don't talk about this to give validation, but I think I talk about it's about how people connect and why do I feel so strongly that leadership is a human experience. Like what we are doing is a human experience. And so I was retiring my chief. So I was asked by my chief at Bagram, this was some years later. He's out of the 105th Base Defense Squadron out of the New York Air National Guard. And him and I were a phenomenal team there. Dave Pritchard and I just made a great team. And so he was retiring and asked me to come back and do his retirement. So we had done the retirement ceremony. We were at the VFW afterwards, having his after party and so forth. And so I had gone into the bathroom for a comfort break and washed my hands and things like that. And I noticed as I was kind of moving towards the bathroom, there was kind of a young man who was kind of, floating around.
Okay.
And so I came out of the restroom as I was finished, and he was waiting there at the exit of the restroom for me, and kind of got in front of me, and he stood there and he looked at me and he goes, "Hey sir, I needed to let you know this, that I was one of the airmen in one of your patrols that got hit by an IED," and he said, "Your investment in us and the words that you used and when you came to talk to us and the faith that you had in us gave me the courage to go back outside of the wire when you asked us to go back outside." And so why that rests so heavy is when you think about what is the consequence there is that somebody believed in you so much that when you spoke to them and said the word, they were going to go back out and do it again in spite of what had just happened to you. And I don't think there is any stronger level of trust that you can ask from somebody than to have one of those moments. And so that moment just resides very, very heavy on my soul, because I think it puts into real tangible context what is the responsibility of leadership? What is your responsibility of leadership?
I'm letting that sit a little bit
Yeah.
because I can't even imagine the amount of feelings that you had first for him, the courage to share that with you, because I'm sure that he really wanted to share that.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can remember perhaps what he might have been referring to, like what you were sharing with the men and women there.
So, it was also a part of things that in times after Bagram have really been used for me as a senior leader on why I reinforce the importance of values. And, this was one particular incident there that really comes to mind is, and I use this when I talk to people, because it's the consequence, and it's why our responsibility as leaders to set the right conditions and culture and all of that is so incredibly valuable. And so I talked to people about a story about we had a situation where we had some real destabilization in the battle space. There was a particular village that we were having some unique challenges with. And we were doing a lot of kind of battlefield shaping, and we were doing some particular village engagement, and the engagement just wasn't happening. And so we were now kind of starting to escalate our interaction with the village a little bit more. And as we were doing that, we were now going to start doing more shaping operations. So it just so happens that one of these nights this was in the late fall, early winter of 2012. Mm-hmm. And we were sending one of our patrols outside to do some shaping and engagement operation there. But this was in the evening. This was a different aspect that we were working for this particular mission. And so mounted up, the airmen are ready to go. They are pushing outside. They're right on time, and everything is going according to plan. And they are getting close to what we call the objective rally point. So that was where they were going to rally up before they actually moved into the village after that. And so everything was going according to plan, and the only thing they needed to do before they got to the objective rally point was really kind of go down a small gully, over a rise, and then they meet at their objective rally point at that point. Okay. And so teams are moving out. First truck over the rise, getting to the point. Second truck over, everything's going fine. Third truck over. Fourth truck gets to that gully, boom, off goes the IED. And what had happened is they knew they were waiting for this opportunity, and they knew exactly what to do. And that is, if you hit the last truck in the movement, you've got 3 trucks that are gone ahead of time, and now we've got folks in a very precarious situation. Right. And so what I talk to people about when we talk about conditions and the real impact that a leader has is I'll talk to them about who was in that truck, who was in that MRAP that we were sending down at that point in time. And inside that MRAP was the face of America. And the explosion was significant. And it did some considerable damage. It threw the engine out of it, penetrated the hull, ripped one of the doors off the side and the front. And so, the truck commander was National Guard from Tennessee. And he had gotten injured, broken an arm because that door had peeled back. And as the door peeled back, his arm got caught and broke an arm. The driver, Asian American coming out of the state of California, active duty. He had injuries to his legs because of the penetration of the hull. We had a gunner up in the turret, African American female from the New York Air National Guard. She had a broken pelvis at the time, and she just stayed on the gun the entire time, despite her injuries. We had our radio operator, European American female coming from the Midwest. She was actually Air Force Reserve. She had a case of TBI from the explosion, and she was still making calls on the radio.
Wow.
We had two of our riflemen in the back. Both came from Hispanic heritage, one of them from Puerto Rican heritage, one of them from Mexican heritage. They were very fortunate that while they got tossed around the back and had some minor TBI issues, they were more or less bumps and bruises, and they were all by themselves.
Yeah, because
and
the
they
others had gone
They
ahead.
were all alone. They were in the middle of Afghanistan. They had just gotten hit. And so for me, what's so important about that story is that if we did not set the right culture and the right values and the right expectations and be a leader by example, and they were harassing each other on Bagram, and they were assaulting each other on Bagram, and they weren't respecting each other on Bagram, and they didn't care about each other on Bagram, they would have died out there that night.
That's right.
But they treated each other like a family, and they cared about each other like a family, and they took care of each other like a family that night, and they lived, and they all came home. So for me, if we're going to talk about what is the true consequence of leadership, and I use consequence deliberately because oftentimes that's used in a pejorative manner, but it's not. This is the true result of your actions, that if you don't set those conditions, then you are legitimately putting your people at risk. And so that whole experience at Bagram, in so many ways that we all carry our scars and our bruises and things like that, I wouldn't trade that experience for the world. But that was tough.
Right.
And I often describe it as a tale of two cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
I think a lot of times when leaders go through experiences like that, they have some more fortunate than others, but a support network. And I would guess it would be your family.
Yeah.
How has your family played a role in these moments in your life in helping you as a leader?
So I will say it's primarily my wife. I have got this wonderful, support of, parents and my in-laws and so forth. And what's been has been truly fortunate is how close I am with my in-laws, because when Lori and I were dating while I was a cadet, anytime I had an overnight or weekend pass, I was over at her mom and dad's house. And so I think that being married to somebody that has truly known you from the beginning, whether we got a training weekend going on or something like that, or I'm working first BCT or whatnot, that Lori was a unique part of all of these things.
Right.
And, I would say that it has been incredibly heartwarming to watch her interact with the cadets here, because it's fun, because her and I we do everything together. And so as we're going to events, like I'll have a group of cadets that I'm talking to, and then I'll look over and Lori's surrounded by a group of cadets who are asking her just very insightful questions about things like, our experiences together and was it tough sending them away on deployments, or how, in those tough times, how do you keep your marriage together? It was just like really insightful questions they ask. But she has just been so central to everything that I do. And so going back a little bit and talking about like the strength of our relationship and how much that helps, we actually needed to have that breakup period. As horribly painful as that was, and wow, was I carrying a torch for her all of those years. I mean, I remember, as time was going by, I would talk to my mom and I'd be like, Mom, I just wish that Lori could see the man that I've become. Ugh. And, but we needed that time because, oftentimes, and what we found in ourselves, we didn't know it at the time because you're living in your environment and you can't see it.
Right. Is
that in youth, things are often absolutes. And you often will get to a place where your marriage, your relationship is growing. And if you start to talk about marriage, there are things that we have found were absolutes for us. Certain things that we did, how we practiced our faith. Did we open up, presents on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day? But the expectation was somebody was going to have to give up their particular tradition to conform to the tradition of one of the spouses. Mm-hmm. And in your youth, that seems reasonable. And I think we needed that time to be apart, having had that time together at such an important time in each of our lives here. But we needed that time apart because I think we needed that frame of reference as we grew as people into adults, grew as young adults, and now all of a sudden here I'm getting multiple assignments and now being thrust into leadership positions with accountability and authority. Right. And then coming back to that, all of a sudden you're realizing, gosh, the world just isn't always in absolutes. Right. And maybe a marriage doesn't have to be zero sum, but maybe a marriage can be positive sum. And do we really have to make somebody give up something that is important to them, that is a part of their identity, because somehow you feel like you have to conform your marriage into one side or the other? And so I think for us, that was so incredibly important. So to kind of get to that story is that, I left Aviano and I went to Aldafra.
Okay.
And I was in Aldafra actually for September 11. It was my first squadron command, but it was a squadron command I wasn't expecting, because I came there as a chief of security forces for about a 70-person security forces flight as a part of the 763rd Expeditionary Air Refueling Squadron at Aldafra.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, 9/11 happens, and we went from about 400 people on Aldafra to about 4,000.
Right.
And, U-2s came in, ISR platforms came in, everything changed. And all of a sudden, this 70-person security forces flight that I had grew into about a 350-person security forces squadron. And AFSET said, hey, Sherman, you built it, you keep it, and we'll replace you with a major when you leave. And I was a 6-year captain. And so then finishing up that assignment, and I got picked up there was a point to that story, but it was about coming back, is that, hey, I got these unique experiences that grew me under my belt. And then I came back to do an AFET program at Cal State San Bernardino. And that was the moment that brought Lori and I back together.
In what way?
And so actually I had a health scare.
Oh.
Coming, and nobody knows what it was.
Right.
We never figured it out.
Wow.
Doctors never figured it out. But it was one of those things, like all of a sudden I shotgunned something out to everybody I knew and said, hey, doctors are a little bit concerned, keep me in your thoughts. And so Lori is like, holy cow, you can't just send a one-liner and leave it at that. So she called my mom and dad and said, what's his phone number? And so it started to turn into, hey, give me all of your test results after you get it back. Then pretty soon it was, hey, we're talking a couple times a week. And then pretty soon we're talking every other day. And then we are talking every day. And the beauty of this was that we already knew each other. So we already knew what everybody's favorite color was. By the way, Lori's is purple. We knew what music each other liked. We knew things about each other. And some of the things that actually drew us together when we were dating here was, we had things like some common family traditions, like, Italian fish on Christmas Eve and sitting around the table for hours and stuff like that were all things that we had in common. So we already knew that about each other.
Right.
Now her and I on the phone, we're getting into some real, like, substantive discussions. Children, faith, how do you raise children? How do you, what are we going to do for different traditions? What happens if I have to take a remote? What does that mean? And so we were getting into these really, really deep conversations. And, I would come back from either class or then when I PCS to the Security Forces Center out at Lackland, I would come home from work, and this was in the old flip phone days where you had a battery that came off the back. So I would have like one battery in the charger, and then I would have a earbud in, and I'd have the phone in my pocket, and I'd come home and to call her, and we would just go throughout the evening. So I'm ironing BDUs at the time,
yes,
shining my boots and stuff like that. And so,
talking with Lori.
And we were just talking. And then it's also got to, we were just kind of like living life together. And, after that point, it became very clear that those two young people who sincerely cared about each other, now each of us grew up and had experiences in a place that allowed us to really appreciate each other and really love each other. And, we were married just a little over a year after that. And, it has been phenomenal in her support. And I think one of the great testaments to that was 10 days after we got married, I went to Baghdad.
Wow.
And so, but she's like, I grew up in the Air Force. I know how this works. We're going to move the house. I'll get the house put together. And she's also a professional in her own right, which is great. So she was working in a legal office here as a paralegal and legal assistant here in Colorado Springs, and has been a GS employee for the last 18 plus years.
Right.
So what's great is like she too has her own aspect of service. What I love about it is that in the jobs that she's in and in the jobs that I'm in, we can talk shop and then we can not talk shop.
Right.
And so she's the first person I go to if I have to ask a question. She's the first person that I'll go to say, hey, did I do that right? Or do I need to backtrack on that a little bit? Because she knows me, and she knows me completely. And that level of trust and love and faith that we have for each other has truly enabled me to be able to serve our airmen on a level that I don't think would have been possible without her.
Would you say that she's had a role in your development as a leader, in the way that you lead?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, and I love it because her experience as a brat and her dad as a chief gives her a very unique lens to look through. And so the advice that she gives me, she can give me from her teenage self in some way, from that experience, watching how her dad interacted with something or knowing her aspect about this. And then as she's developed professionally, working on the E-ring and the Pentagon a couple different times, working for very senior leaders, knows how to navigate that space. So then I'll go to her for advice, like, hey, how did your boss handle something like this? And she, well, let me tell you how we worked through this. And so I would absolutely say that Lori has uniquely influenced and helped me to become the best version of myself that I can be.
Wow. Well, I want to ask you a little bit about developing yourself as well, because one of the questions we like to ask is, what are you doing every day to make yourself a better leader? Can you share what that might be?
For me, and I've said it a couple times during this, like I truly believe that leadership is a human experience.
Yes.
And so for me, it's about the interaction. And so oftentimes advice that I've given to people, like there are amazing resources abound that can help give people leadership perspectives, and we can either learn it from history or we can learn it through study. We can learn it through analysis. We can learn it through books. And I've always talked to people about use that kind of external, the external tools that help to grow you, but make sure that you're using it to influence the personality that you already have. Because oftentimes what happens is that people will have this really strong desire to say, okay, I want to make sure that I do this right. And so in doing this right, let me make sure I've got my checklist. And so I'm going to greet them. I'm going to ask them how their family is. I'm going to ask them if the kid did all right in the baseball game. And I'm going to go through my checklist. And if I do that, I fulfilled my leadership obligation. Now, not everybody does this.
Right.
And I'm making generalities on, but I think that there can oftentimes be the allure that when you are focusing on what may be the theory or the principle of the day and not using it to supplement and grow and mature your personality, that there is a strong allure to want to wholesale replicate what it was that you learned. And you're doing it in a noble place. It's not nefarious. It's being done in a noble, genuine place. But there's that allure to say, okay, good. I really like what I've learned. I'm going to do these things and step through. And so why I talk so much about the experience and why I talk so much about the interaction is that the more that you know the people that you may be influencing by just simply being there and understanding what that means, it means you're internalizing the value of your presence. You're listening to their stories and you're understanding for them what are the things that are, that are motivating them. What are the things that they value? Because each generation, each environment, each condition is going to require something a little bit different from you. And if you don't take the time to understand your environment or generational or cultural nuances or things like that on where you're at, then you are missing that opportunity to develop trust where they start to believe in you as a person and not just the rank and position that you hold. Because they'll do the right thing for the rank and position that you hold. That's the caliber of people that we have in this Air Force of ours. They'll do the right thing. But if you transcend that in the fact that they believe in you wholeheartedly and trust you, oftentimes with their own lives, it means that you've invested something into them where they truly know that you care.
Right.
And that goes back to that A1C on the corkboard that said, I need somebody who cares about me as a person.
Right. Right. As I think about what you've experienced through your career and the lessons you've learned both professionally and personally, what would you say to yourself back then that you should be doing back then to get to where you're at now? Because we have listeners that are like, what can I start planting today that will bloom down the road?
Absolutely. And so I think if I was to go back and put my arm around, Cadet First Class Sherman, I think what I would do is, because it is oftentimes easy to do, to look in the crystal clear mirror of hindsight.
Right.
But I think instead what I would do is I would put my arm around him and say, keep following your heart and let the failures happen, because the failures are going to grow, and let the stumbles happen and enjoy the triumphs with people and be appreciative for what got you there. And I think it would be more of the encouragement of like, you have laid out a path for you. Take the path wherever it goes, the joy, the pain, the triumph, the failure, all of those things, because all of that helps to develop the leader. And oftentimes you want to go back and say, gosh, if I was going to talk to my previous self, then I would say, don't do that one thing.
Right.
But I'm looking at it saying that if I didn't do that one thing, then I'm not sure that I would be where I'm at a time to make sure I didn't do that thing at a moment that was incredibly catastrophic.
Right.
And so while we have this desire to want to prevent ourselves from the failure, I think that what we have to do is say, you're going to fail. Right. And you need to fail. And it's going to sound relish in the failure, because it is often emotionally troubling for those, especially those of us that come here, because we are type A perfectionists, and that's part of the draw of coming to this amazing place, is there are certain personality traits that help us to be successful here. But not all of those personality traits make us uniquely successful in all situations outside. And so you've got to have that failure at some point in time, and the failure that you can get up and say, okay, I did this happened. My soul is bruised. My ego is bruised. I may have to take a little bit of accountability for this. Okay, now I need to have the courage to take the next step forward again.
Right.
Because I could easily retreat back to a safe place, and I could become risk averse, and all that does is hurt the people around you. Okay, I have to have the courage to breathe and take the step again and get back in there. So I would tell I don't think I would want to prevent myself from doing anything. I think even the growth that took place while Lori and I were apart, and like I said, that torch that I carried for her,
Right.
I think if I had whispered in my ear and said, "Hey man, just relax, you're gonna marry her," I think I needed that torch, because that, in my own mind and my own emotion, was me needing to become a better man. And so I think I needed to go through, like,
Right.
sometimes you need the struggle, and sometimes the things that are most valuable are the things that you had to go through the struggle for.
Right.
And I think that's where my blue collar ethics background comes in. Is like, I'm just going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to work through the struggle.
Well, we took a look back. I just want to
Yeah.
ask you a question forward. So
Yes.
do you think about legacy and what you want your legacy to be? Is that something that plays in your mind as you wake up each morning or go to lead people?
I think the way that I look at it is, I look at it in a different aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I look at it is in a very confined point to point.
Mm.
It's not about what is going to be Tom Sherman's legacy when he retires someday, but was that interaction that I had with somebody to give them some encouraging words when they fell down, did that matter to them at that moment? Because there are people, for me, in my failures, that were commanders, that were leaders, that were mentors, that were senior enlisted, that, grabbed that lieutenant by the arm and helped to lift me up. And their memories are etched in my fabric. And so I think that it's about that individual event,
Mm-hmm.
that your legacy will live in the people in which you made a difference to them.
Well, I'll share with you just, I was telling my son, he's a cadet, a third class cadet. Actually, now he's about to be C2C.
All right.
That I was doing this podcast with
Yeah.
you, and he said, "What an incredible leader, Mom. He motivates me. He's so inspiring." So your legacy is already
Thank
through
you.
my son.
Thank you.
Well,
That means thank you so much for sharing that. That
you
really
should
warms
know
my
that
heart.
that you've really made an impact.
Thank
So
you.
we're gonna get to your final thoughts here in a little bit, but before we do, want to make sure that our podcasts publish on every second Tuesday of the month, and you can certainly listen to General Sherman and any of our other podcasts on longblueleadership.org. So, General Sherman,
Yes.
what would you like to leave our listeners with today? This has been incredible, by the way.
Thank you. I have truly enjoyed this, and it was just wonderful having the conversation with you.
Yes,
and
thank you.
It's a real honor to be a part of this. I truly believe in what you're doing here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to help share your story and help inspire others. And is there anything we might leave with our listeners that they can part with tonight with you?
I think for me, you need to love what you do. And love, I think, is one of the most powerful words in language. And I don't just say the English language, I say in language, because of the strength behind the meaning and how wide the meaning can be impactful. If you love what you do, people will feel that. Your very presence will make a difference. They'll feel that. If you love what you do, then you're being, internally inspired by the love that you have for what you're being a part of.
Right.
If you love and care about your people, they will follow you to the ends of the earth because they know the passion that you have and the belief that you have in them. So I think that as we go back to these things, we oftentimes look at the terms of courage and love may seem diametrically opposed. And I would attest that you can be most courageous and that your courage will be most effective only when it's buttressed by the love that you have in what you do and who you do it with.
Thank you, sir, for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being on Long Blue Leadership.
Absolutely. Thank you. This was a wonderful time.
Yes,
it was
sir.
a real honor.
Thank you. Well, until next time, I'm Naviere Walkewicz. We'll see you on Long Blue Leadership. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Long Blue Leadership. The podcast drops every 2 weeks on Tuesdays and is available on all your favorite podcast apps. Send your comments and guest ideas to us at socialmedia@usafa.org and listen to past episodes at longblueleadership.org.